Hello and welcome to today's Movers and Shakers virtual event. My name's Lee Natasha Salter and I'm Managing Director of Movers and Shakers. I hope you've all had a great week so far. So today is the first in our series of mini lectures and we're starting with a city series. So the mini lectures are aimed to be short, informative, fun and thoughtful talks. And in terms of cities, what we're starting to look at is comparing to past cities, looking across time and across space, comparing and looking at what we can learn from each other. Today, we welcome to start the series Tim Stonner, who is Managing Director and owner of Space Syntex. And he's going to start by looking at what did the Romans ever do for urban planning and design. We'll then have a response from Patricia Brown, who is Director of Central. So thank you to you both for joining us today. So Tim's going to be going back to the Roman era, looking at what things we've learnt and what we've gained from the Romans, obviously in terms of design and obviously in terms of urban planning. How have things changed? Have we actually learned the lessons of the past? What can we learn from each other? So really interesting. He's going to focus on walkability, on streets, on public space and on mixed use planning. So lots to look forward to. And when we look at design, he's going to be looking at good design from the perspective of the Romans and good design today. You know, what does it mean? How's it changed? Is it purely functional or does it serve a great purpose and meaning for the community and for culture? So we welcome Tim and we're really delighted to have Patricia as well on the platform. Now Pat is actually an expert in the dynamics of cities. She's an absolute expert in adopting positive changes for cities. So really looking forward to hearing her response. We will have time, I'm sure, for some questions from the audience. So please do get typing in the chat. We'll try our best to answer as many of your questions as possible. So thank you very much indeed and enjoy.
Thank you very much, Lee, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. And I hope in the title of this talk, What Did the Romans Ever Do?, that you recognize the Monty Python scene from the life of Brian, to which the answer, what have the Romans ever done for us, is a long list of positive items and issues: medicine, education, public order, irrigation, wine, fresh water and public health. And I thought it would be helpful to look a little further at the world of urban design, the world of placemaking, and to take that ironic question, what have the Romans ever done for us, and reflect on what I think has been the huge legacy of the Romans. And Pat's going to join me in a few minutes to share some specific thoughts, I think, about London and the work that we've done together. But I've got a few slides to share with you first to set the scene and to give my personal perspective on what the Romans have done for us. So I'm hoping they're coming through to your end now, and I'm sure someone will tell me if there's any problem. But I had the opportunity a few years ago to spend the day in Pompeii, and if you've been to Pompeii, you know what a rich place it is in terms of the history that's been uncovered after the devastation of Vesuvius back in AD 79. And as I walked around as an architect, as a town planner, I started to recognize so many of the issues and items that seem to be prevalent in today's conversation about how towns and cities should be. So I want to share some of those thoughts with you. The first thing I realized pretty quickly as I moved around Pompeii, and just to give you a sense of it, the baths are up there, top left, the arena over on the right-hand side, the theatre at the bottom, and the forum to the lower left, is that it's not a big place. It's 800 meters by a kilometer. And it makes me realize, what did the Romans ever do for urban design? Well, I think they gave us the 15-minute city that is now being talked about all over the world as an ideal. it was an ideal back then. This is not a new idea. And if we look a little closer at the street network of Pompeii, that 15-minute city is continuously linked together. All of the streets form a grid. It's really easy to move through that grid. What did the Romans do for urban design? They gave us the connected street grid, not the detached housing estate, the enclave, the gated community. Far from it. They gave us a permeable and a walkable street grid that today we're trying to emulate. And I think we rarely come close to in the kinds of new towns that we're creating and extensions of existing places, but we perhaps can learn from the convenience of Pompeii. Let's look a little closer at the main street of Pompeii, the Decumanus running east-west across the city. And the first thing that struck me, I've just highlighted in yellow there, is the generous width of the pavement. There's as much pavement in yellow as there is road space in red. What does that mean? Well, it means that there is a balance between the modes, between the walking mode and the driving mode. It's talked about today as being good to have in our town centres, mixed mode mobility, not streets that are dominated by traffic, but streets where, as a pedestrian, you're on a par with someone in a vehicle moving past you. And because that street is narrow, you can't go fast. And so it's slow speed, slow mobility. Lining those streets are shops right on the street, street retail. There was no shopping mall, no turning the back on the highway, but direct street-related retail. That, of course, helps to humanize the street. It helps it to feel buzzing. It helps it to become a place in which life thrives. And just behind, so there's the street in the distance in this next image. The bright light is the street where I just took that last photograph. Just behind is where people are living. They're living behind the shop. There was no shame in the rich Pompeii merchant living above and behind the shop. In fact, there was the convenience of being close to the place of work. And that means no commute, no time sat in a vehicle, in a traffic jam, getting back home, being stressed mentally and unhealthily physically. And that kind of mixed use planning is where we should be going. And it's where policy is telling us where to go. And we could see it from the Romans. Turn around and look behind. We've got immense greenery. Those houses having internal gardens, external gardens that are green. Biophilic design, the presence of nature in towns is something which many of my colleagues and I are trying to bring into the urban planning that we do. Often very subtly, making every house green, not having great wide parks dividing up the housing into little pockets and packets, but no, much more subtly interwoven into the way that we live. Let's go back out onto the street. And one of the highlights for me of Pompeii was pedestrian crossings. The zebra crossing, you could imagine if that were painted white, a very familiar object on every high street in the UK. The Romans were there first. And you might think, well, why the big high stones? Why the big high curbs? Well, those pedestrian crossings have another function. Those curbs especially have another function. They're there for street cleansing. What the Romans could do by controlling water was to flush the streets of the dirt, the animal dirt that was there otherwise among them. And what this is integrated infrastructure. It's using one thing for many purposes. It's bringing the street cleansing, the pedestrian crossings, the curb design into a very efficient form of street engineering. I just noticed this one last night looking through my photographs. If you look really carefully at the pedestrian crossing, you can see the grooves. I'll just highlight them in red there. The grooves of the wheels of the vehicles that go through there. Now, I thought, oh, well, those have been worn through over time, but no, they've been cut deliberately. Because if you're in a wheeled vehicle approaching the stones of that pedestrian crossing, you want to make absolutely sure your wheels go between the stones. So what the Roman engineers have done is to carve those grooves so that your wheels are channeled and you can't, other than go safely through the crossing. You're no longer in control at that point. The engineering is controlling your vehicle. It reminds me of autonomous transport. The self-driving car can be found in the Roman design of Pompeii. I've got a thing about pedestrian crossings. Pat might say more about this, but pedestrian crossings shouldn't be away from the junction at the convenience of the traffic engineer to let the vehicles turn. They should be at the junction because that is the pedestrian desire line. Pedestrian desire line design means thinking people first, putting the crossing on the same alignment as the pavement, approaching and going beyond it. But so often traffic engineers push the crossing out the way, surrounded by guardrail, and make it inconvenient for the pedestrian to make it convenient for the vehicle. The Romans didn't do that. The pedestrians clearly came first. And where those pedestrians concentrated was the Forum. The Forum being a place of no vehicles, or possibly low vehicles, a low traffic neighborhood, a place where you couldn't just drive through, you had to drive around, and that then gave priority to the public realm. How did they enforce that? Well, what did the Romans ever do for urban design? They gave us the bollard, and they gave us them in abundance in order to stop any careering out of control vehicle from entering the Forum and causing devastation. But my last point from Pompeii is, what did the Romans do? Well, they didn't just do the pragmatic everyday engineering. They gave us fun. They gave us high quality design. The sculptures, the paintings of Pompeii embellished that engineering with the everyday beauty of the place. And perhaps this is something for debate. Is this the claw of an eagle, or is it three puppies drinking from a trough? That was a debate in my house last night. I'm with the puppies on this one, but apparently it could also be interpreted as an eagle's claw. Now, those lessons really mattered to me in my practice, and in cities all over the world, we're seeing these principles played out in policy. So working in Darwin, in the Northern Territory of Australia, we've been thinking about the 15-minute city, thinking about biophilic design to create new connections that stitch together the new city with the old city and do it within a green landscape that helps cool the air and create shelter from the rain. In central London, working at the Elephant and Castle, taking what was a blockage to pedestrian permeability and introducing a street-based network of lanes, pathways, and a central park, connected street grid, and a low traffic neighborhood, learning from Pompeii, applying to central London. You may remember, if you know the Elephant, that there used to be roundabouts and subways, and pedestrians were second to vehicles. This southern roundabout at the Elephant was taken away, and we produced a concept for pedestrian desire line design to create surface crossings on the routes that pedestrians would naturally take, not the ones that engineers would force them into. And wherever we go, we're working to connect parts of cities that have been severed and divided by vehicle engineering that didn't think pedestrian first, whether here in Newcastle, connecting Northumberland Street, the retail core, with Newcastle University through a pedestrian walkway. Central London, connecting Bloomsbury to Covent Garden to St Giles, by removing some of the road space and creating the equal space for pavements to the equal space for vehicles, and sharing the city amongst everyone and always being pedestrian first. The place perhaps that exemplifies this for me the best is Trafalgar Square, a project which works so well that many people don't know that it's new, which is the Central Stairs. The project began 25 years ago to close the pavement, but the road between the National Gallery and the square, to put in pedestrian crossings on the desire lines, to remove the ugly guardrail, to think pedestrian first, and perhaps in retrospect to be thinking in the way that the Romans had taught us, even if we hadn't realized it at the time. It's a project that I worked on with Foster and Partners, and I worked on with my old friend, Pat Brown, who was the leading person in lobbying for this scheme between the public and private sectors, demonstrating why London needed to change. And so it's a moment for me to pause and bring Pat in and ask her to share her own thoughts on what the Romans have ever done for urban design, and perhaps where London might want to go next in terms of its improvements.
Hello, and thank you, Tim. That was brilliant, really beautifully done, and thank you. And it was a perfect moment to pick up on what you just said about Elephant and Castle and link back to what you were talking about in the Roman lessons and the notion of the forum, and just reflecting a little bit about the Trafalgar Square project. In fact, you mentioned that I was the leading person lobbying for it to happen. And the reality is it almost didn't happen. And what it was being looked at was a traffic gyratory. And we've heard from Tim already that, in order to make places walkable and permeable and to put people at the heart of them, we have to think about making it convenient and things like desire lines. And once upon a time, Tim's work at Space Syntax demonstrated that if you were in the Mall side of Trafalgar Square, the southwest corner of Trafalgar Square, and you wanted to go to the northeast section towards St. Martin's in the Fields, it would actually take you 9 minutes to walk across on foot, because that was the point. That was because everything, all the crossings were actually predicated towards expeditious movement of the motor vehicle, as we used to call it at the time, and not about making it easier for people. So this was a piece of space which was actually London's and the UK's most important forum, yet people were really almost banned from getting through it more easily. So the scheme that Foster's worked on, and Tim and others, and myself included, made happen was to really reconnect people back with this really important space. And it was where I jumped for joy on the day that we discovered that London had won the 2012 Olympic Games, and where many of us will have celebrated or watched or enjoyed being in that space. So it's a really important example of giving people civic space. So just reflecting on what you said, Tim, thank you. It was absolutely fascinating. And what I heard was that really this was about integrated thinking. It was about really thinking about how people could and should live, and designing cities, the houses and the flats, because Romans also lived in flats, maybe not in Pompeii, but they had apartments, for the not so rich ones. How those spaces were going to be developed to create the optimum living, based around, as we've also heard from Tim, about public health and open space and greenery, that biophilia. But the mixed uses, thinking about how people trade, and what that barrier, those shops also represented a barrier from the rather busy hectoring noise in the streets. And then there was a whole layer of rooms designed in a different way in order to create perfect living conditions, including the open space at the back. And I think that's really important lesson for us now, because I don't think we think enough about that whole picture, the holistic picture of what do we want to be able to give people in terms of the homes, the quality of the spaces, the way that connects into the wider neighborhoods, and in order to live the best possible life. And it's critical really for the future of our planet in terms of sustainability, because if we don't want people to use cars, if we want people to live a more sustainable lifestyle, wouldn't it be so much better if we actually give them places, it's all about us, give us places to live in that enables us to do those things that we need, which to a certain extent is the notion of the 15-minute city, connecting in easily, whether that's to the child's nursery or a good DIY shop, a place to go and get your hair cut and your shoes healed, and a whole host of other things that enable you to do those things in a pleasant, easy, connected way, leaving the car, if you need one at all, behind for as much of that journey as possible. And all of this really needs thinking, orchestrating. I think that London needs a conductor. We need somebody that has a guiding hand, that brings in the different elements at the right time, and putting all the time the needs of people at the heart, which takes me to the thing that we wouldn't want necessarily to emulate from the Romans, which is the notion of plebeians and patricians. My namesake, I am obviously a patrician. But there was the plebeians, the people who were left out of the decision making right at the start of the sort of the Roman Empire, had to make a case to be brought into the Senate and the thinking of how the city was planned. And it was a very unequal society. You know, what we see, these beautiful villas with amazing lives in which were eating fabulous meals in beautiful surroundings, was what it was like for the rich, but there was hordes of slaves and people who were significantly poorer serving that society. And just thinking about the pandemic, there's a certain bit of life that's been a little bit like that over the past year for some of us, hasn't it? You know, the ones who could work from home, that had good access to public space and Wi-Fi, whilst we waited for the food delivery man or the Amazon delivery person to service our every need. So, you know, in all of this, how do we ensure that the society that we build is not about the haves and the have-nots, but we create an equal society where we take the needs of all sorts of people and different income groups into consideration as we plan this perfect neighborhood on the perfect neighborhoods, to ensure that we are taking lots of different quality of life and quality of experience is there for people on all sorts of different income groups. So, and that's at the heart of an initiative I'm working on, and many of you might have heard me talk about it before, and it's a subject for another time, which is London 3.0. How do we go back to what the Romans were doing, which was thinking about all these different elements coming in and ensuring that we future-proof in terms of urban innovation and a whole host of other things to make sure that the sum of the parts adds up to something that is greater than the whole. And amongst all of that, we have a wonderful civic space in order to enjoy our beautiful city. And on that note, I'll end. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you, Lee.
Thanks, Pat. I knew it would be a great response. How superb. Thank you very much indeed. Now, we've got a few questions, but first of all, Tim, did you want to say anything back to Pat? Was there any comments that you sort of pick up from what Pat said?
Yeah, I would. Thank you, Lee. The comment about inequality, and I think relating the inequalities of Pompeii with the inequalities of today is just as important. I mean, I've emphasized features of physical and spatial design, but equally there are features of economic and governance that also need to be taken into consideration. I guess my question to Pat would be, is there a physical, I've described Pompeii in glowing terms, that, it's great that it has this network of streets and this street-based retail and the forum and the control of the vehicle and so on. But is there anything in that that's actually working to exacerbate inequality, or is there something that architects, planners, placemakers can be doing to address inequality?
I think one of the most important questions in all of this or points in all of this is looking at different needs of different people, so that you address needs, and through that inequalities, by understanding what it takes to live a life, whatever age or stage you're at. And the very Roman road, Oxford Street, is a great example of that, for example, where there's a huge debate about pedestrianisation of it and taking buses out of it. But what happens if you're claustrophobic and don't want to use a tube, and once upon a time you couldn't physically get on the tube at all? Many people have got bags, push chairs, a whole host of things. So sometimes the debate gets led by a group of people with a very particular point of view. So I think looking at it in a 360-degree way, ensuring that we take lots of different views into consideration, is absolutely fundamental to make sure that whatever is designed isn't for the agile set of the age range, but works for everybody.
That sounds good. We've got a question coming in. Let me just have a look here. So it says, there is lots of discussion around the repurposing of the high street. What do you think are the biggest lessons learned from the Romans? How do we apply their logic to today's challenges? Tim, do you want to go first? Or
yeah, well, I think what I've learned from Pompeii, what I've learned from the historic high streets of England, is they were never just about shops, and that the idea that you improve the high street today by a different approach to shopping seems to miss the point. It's a different approach to living which is needed. So there are massive opportunities to do what I showed in that image, of bring people back to live on high streets and live in our town centres. The typical English town centre has very low levels of residential occupation. People live outside the ring road that's typically around the town centre, which means after hours the town centre's empty of anybody who isn't out there eating and drinking. It's not a place for everyday life. So I think living in the town centre, living on the high street, living above the shop, and the opportunities coming from post-pandemic lifestyles of not being able to take mass public transport in the way before, needing to find work closer to where you live because you can't physically commute in the way that you did before. I live in a town outside of London where if I wasn't able to work from home, I'd be wanting to look to work in town. And I think I'd be looking for an office in town. Those aren't being provided to the degree that perhaps they would have been provided in Rome, or would be applied if we applied Roman thinking to the UK. So I think we address through living and working and not just shopping.
Pat, do you have any comments on that?
I support everything that Tim said. I just think it also goes back to that old nursery rhyme, which is the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, and make sure that this is about, having lots of smaller shops that can be supported and sustain a life. There's more, ensuring that there is access to what you need. It was what I said in my response, really, as opposed to making people go to the Herculaneum or wherever it was. That was the Pompeii's equivalent of the outer town retail, Ercolano, I think it's called in Italian, isn't it? So yeah, it's ensuring that you've got the whole experience, and as Tim said, it's got lots of different uses, and again, it's got lots of different ages and people using it.
And I think also sort of the pandemic's brought this to the forefront of our minds. And I think this is the way people are beginning to think. I do see some change in this sense. And, you know, that I think is going to be a focus going forward. That kind of brings us a bit more to the 15-minute city. You know, how do we meet the ambition of sort of the walkability cycling, the 15-minute city? And what would sort of regional leaders need to do to make this possible?
Well, we're not going to meet it if we carry on doing what we've been doing, which is building housing estates that are car dependent on the outskirts of town. We need to do a lot more and go a lot further. Walkability is measurable. My business, Space Syntax, is in the business of measuring walkability, and the difference is made in three key ways. First, having a diversity of land uses close to where you live, i.e. having shops, having jobs, having healthcare, having school within a 5 or 10 minute walk. And if you don't have that, it's not going to be walkable. That's almost the first point. You can't just build houses, therefore you have to build place. And that's a real challenge to the way that we finance the building of housing, because we can't afford to build schools and we can't afford to put all those other things to the degree that they're going to be needed. We need public transport is the second point. And that means really good bus service to give you the alternative to using a car. If a journey is slightly longer than a walk and can't be cycled for whatever reason, you need public transport. And the third is you need a connected street network to bring it all together. Those are the three elements. And if we're not thinking about doing those, we're not going to be delivering the 15-minute city.
Pat,
I think I really support this issue about land use, and also, you know, there's been, just going back over the past year, there's been, you know, a rise in the notion of neighborhood living and people enjoying living their places. But I think, you know, going back to my point earlier, that's not everybody. People's experiences have been very different. And there's been some really good research studies over the past year looking at people's conditions, living conditions and quality of experience during the pandemic. And one of the findings from one of them was that if you lived in, say, the Blackheath or the Hampstead Heaths or somewhere around Stoke Newington High Street, you're far more likely to say that you had very good living conditions during the pandemic, even if you had a public space. It was rather crowded in Clissold Park, but nonetheless, you know, that sort of village life was the optimal sort of living conditions during lockdown. People who were living on newer, higher density developments were the ones who reported that they didn't enjoy the quality of experience during lockdown, and they did have a public space deficit and they didn't have those amenities. So I think we need to do audits of place right across London and look at what we're providing there. And going back to my orchestra analogy, ensuring that we're actually playing the right sort of tune to give people what they need. And there's all sorts of unintended consequences of growth over the past 10 plus years. We know that we've lost a really high proportion of our industrial space and space for things like box stores like B&Qs and a whole host of other things, but also they've been gobbled up by housing. The amenities that they've and the facilities that have actually made way to create those housing estates are not being replaced. So where are the plum merchants? Where are the things that enable us to just pop out on a Saturday morning to get the things that we need? So we can't give with one hand, which is taking, you know, giving people places to from home, but take on the other, which is taking away the basic amenity that enables to live that complete life within an easy walking distance.
We've had a question that's come in, and it is a bit, it's with regards to sort of the pandemic and the changes that we've seen, and people sort of looking for the idea of, widening pavements, because of the shift to walking and to cycling and for the more green space. Will there be longer term changes? Do you think this will happen? Do you think we'll lose sight of it immediately after the pandemic, or do you think this is going to be embedded into kind of future planning?
Shall I kick off on that? I think behaviour change is very slow, and the work I did at Central London Partnership, aided by the likes of Tim, was partly about helping people actually see that walking and cycling in London, in central London especially, was the way to go. We wanted to create a place that felt great for people to walk in, be in. That sort of sense of continental European city environments was what we were pushing. And then there was the notion of having to give things up to accommodate that. So, reducing car use and so on and so forth. And congestion charge was one of the most ambitious and successful experiments with behaviour change. And by and large, it really did help. And yet, some of the other things have been slower to take off. And there's been a lot of arguments, as people know, around low traffic neighbourhoods and making putting cycle provision in. This goes back to my point about how and who we communicate with and consult with, and understanding that one person's walkable space is another person's lack of something else, and having enough of the consultation and dialogue and engagement to see to take communities with you. But critically in all of this, so going back to the pandemic demonstrated people wanted to walk and cycle at the point that they didn't have anything else to do. Whether that is long-term behaviour change, the jury is still out. The space that has been given to those people is absolutely fantastic, but it was done so in a temporary way. So it takes me to my final point, which is, if it is to be made permanent, we have to go back and design it properly, as opposed to just have lots of plastic cones all over the place. And one of my bugbears about some of the work that goes on is we're not very good at designing something with an inbuilt mechanism for iteration and change. We tend to design something as a one-size-fits-all that we put in place and don't look at it again for another 10 or 20 years. So in all of what I'm saying, I think we need to keep looking at what people want to do, how people want to live, and flexing our urban thinking and urban design as a consequence of that.
My own view is that the coronavirus has been an accelerator of change that was already happening. Mm-hmm. And the move to walking and cycling has been put into focus by the inability for people to drive in the same way as before, take the train in the same way before, or the bus or the tube. And the places that seem, I'd like to have the good evidence on this, but the places that seem to be being successful are the ones that were already doing it. They were already thinking about their public realm. And the places that have struggled are the ones that have had it forced on them and have had to think, how do I now think about pedestrians? And so the places that are going to continue this thinking once we've all been vaccinated and we've controlled the virus are going to be the ones who have that mindset. And I wouldn't be at all surprised, sadly, if some places go back to the same old, because they just see this as a blip that they need to deal with. And it's the structural change that's going to make the difference to the long-term survival. So, we've now got a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit in Faversham here in Kent. That's been 5 years in planning, but the coronavirus made it happen a year before it would otherwise have done, because it was put in overnight as an emergency action. It was already in the mix. And what will, I think, make the difference, one of the things that will make the difference to whether places get the importance of what we're talking about is to integrate not just the design, the physical design, but to integrate the thinking the governance that goes into the decision making. We have a separate Department of Transport from a Department of Communities and Department of Housing, these are all separated. It's inevitable we're going to end up with separate systems. It's inevitable we're not going to be able to have integrated long-term thinking if we're basically siloed from the very beginning.
Very good point. I've got a couple of questions come in now. They've just come in a flurry, so let me try and get through a couple and see what we can do. So
and the dog next door agrees with me. If you can hear the dog barking in the background, that's an agreeing dog, not a disagreeing dog.
So I know somebody's here. There's a lot of discussion around bringing smaller independent retailers, crafts, artisans back to the high street. Do you think this is a realistic ambition?
Yes, completely.
Yeah, and in the first in the downturn, the 2008-2009 downturn, we saw the rise of Meanwhile, and the developers, landowners, shop owners looked to the creative sector, the cultural sector, to really breathe life into these places. And I think one of the things we have to do now is make sure that that sector is no longer just a cash cow that is sufficient to help us get our struggling high streets back on the street, but they become mainstream part of our civic life.
Okay, now sorry, go on, Tim. No, I was rushing through the questions. Of course, answer, please.
Well, just this assumption that goes into why investors invest in places, and the wrong assumption that what people are looking for is another lane on the highway to connect that town with the rest of the country. They're not. People are looking for local difference. People are wanting to invest in places because they have something that isn't the normal, the everyday, the international. They're looking for the local craft, the local texture, the local people. They're not looking for another lane on the motorway.
That is interesting. I think, it has highlighted, so just then intercepting the local, the prominence of local, I love it, having that unique local, and culture, I think, needs to be viewed in that same way. And when you sort of talked about design, and it was actually really interesting, Tim, because when you mentioned that slide, I'd had a debate this morning with my son. I'd showed him that slide and I was like, oh, I actually thought they were kittens. Look at the kittens there. And he said, no, it's a claw. And isn't that weird, those? But how beautiful are the designs and things, and how unique is that sometimes to sort of localities and bringing the whole sort of cultural agenda back? I mean, phenomenal. Anyway, I will go on to the next question eventually, to do with gardens and greenery. So the idea of bringing gardens and greenery into a city is important for all sorts of reasons, of course. Can current planning legislation deliver that?
Tim, do you want to go first?
Well, I don't see any reason why not. I think it just needs thoughtfulness and it needs care. And my concern is that we try to do too much of it. One of the big mistakes of the post-Second World War New Towns program was that it was a greenwash. Places like Skelmersdale outside of Liverpool, Manchester, just too much green space. I'm not saying we shouldn't have green space, but town has to come first. And then every single street needs to be lined with a green verge. Every wall, I'm surrounded by green here because we've chosen to do it. But I'm still living in the middle of a town of 20,000 people and it's still walkable. So there's nothing in the planning that's stopping any of this around me happening. It's down to, is it given enough care by the authority to support it, and then that nurtures local people to want to do it themselves.
So agree with Tim as always, but I just want a couple of other thoughts. Is that absolutely we can do it, as Tim has already said, and also the natural capital net gain, the whatever it's called, which developers have got to do as part of the planning process, will actually bring the notion of biodiversity right off the agenda. I think it's what is that green space for? And quite often green space is actually there as a manicured looking set of box hedges and lawns that are impossible to do anything on. So it has to be meaningful space for people to both enjoy in its own right, but also use as well, which takes us to the notion of creating cities for and places around play and enjoyment as well. So be careful how you design in these things, as well as what as well as just wanting to provide for it. And it takes us back full circle to the foundations of the National Trust, which 125 years on was founded because of the lack of green space for the urban masses. And we have to get back up to that priority.
No, absolutely. Okay, last question here. It's an important social question. The baths formed an important part of the fabric of the Roman city as a social environment. There are similar baths in some European cities, but there isn't something we have like that in the UK. Do you think there's a demand for a contemporary large bath or large baths as a social place rather than conventional swimming pools, etc.?
What a great question.
Different?
Maybe.
Well, you can go to the one on the top of Bath Spa.
Yeah.
Which is a social space.
Yeah.
Because of course the baths were, I think they were built more for social. I'm not sure the Romans thought through the idea of, we're keeping ourselves necessarily clean, bringing less disease in. I think it was actually, they were brought about for a social reason, for social cohesion, bringing people together. Rather than that agenda.
Can I give a plug? I am an ambassador for something called the Thames Baths, which is a project which was dreamt up by Chris Romilly and from Studio Octopi. The idea of having a floating Lido or Lido in the River Thames. And we've been talking to a range of developers and various people, the Port of London Authority amongst them, to make that a reality. And we are looking for sites, and there's some beautiful designs, and that is meant to be a place where you can actually just connect with the city, as well as actually use it as a question is here about a conventional swimming pool. So look it up, everybody. Thames Baths, it's beautiful.
Or we can send that out in an emailer to people, perhaps. Absolutely. And, it helps with the problem of loneliness that's only been exacerbated with the pandemic. But the idea of something social, something that's free as well, so that everybody can have access to it, I think that's really important. Any final comments? We sort of run out of time now, guys. Is there anything you want to give a sort of final point of, Tim? Pat?
I just think that we have a long tradition of bathing in the UK, and I think it's something the Victorians also introduced. I've heard of baths being restored. So maybe the person who asked that question might be pleasantly surprised to see that there's a lot more happening than ever before. But no, I think the 15-minute city, the walkable city, we've had them for thousands of years. They're really under threat by us having the ability to jump in cars, and we have a decision to make. It's a decision based on governance, but the good that comes from walking and mixed use and slow and local is evident to be seen, and it's valuable.
Right. So my final comments, and I'm just going to pick up on something that's gone on the chat a moment ago. Before we go for the Thames Baths, do you think we need to stop Thames water sewage into the Thames? Well, that's precisely what the Thames Tideway Tunnel is doing. Mm-hmm. And in about 3 or 4 years, when that is completed, it will stop that from happening. And it's really important to remind ourselves that that is a piece of infrastructure that we have been quietly building underneath London's built form, in the same way as Bazalgette built the sewers in the Victorian era. So we can actually do these things. Sometimes it takes us a long time, and sometimes we forget we can do it, which is what I wanted to say as my final point, really, which is this notion of civicness and being in a public place is something that we've really embraced over the past 20-25 years. We wanted to make it happen. We chipped away at it, the likes of Tim and myself. And actually, it's been a part of life that for people of a certain age don't realize just how much has changed. We have achieved, by and large, much more of that continental European city. And therefore, I think going full circle to that notion of what do the Romans do for us, what our continental Europeans cousins have shown us that we can enjoy our cities. And I think there's a lot that we can still build on to make sure that that's accessible to even more people. So that's my final comment. Thank you.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Pat. Really great way to end. I think you're absolutely right. And that's why we kind of want to do this mini series. We want to look at cities of the past, but also contemporary cities. And we can all learn so much from each other. And both of you have done tremendous work in this space on the dynamics of cities and positive change. But it's important to look back, and it's important, obviously, to look forward. Let's hope that we carry on post-pandemic with some of the really positive changes that have happened. But thank you so much, both of you. I know we're completely out of time now, and we could have carried on all afternoon, but I'm sure everybody really enjoyed the session. So really appreciate it for both of you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
Thank you.
And I just want to say to our audience about our next event. So our next Movers and Shakers virtual event will be next Wednesday. And next Wednesday's event is our second event in the series of the road to COP26. And we'll be looking at circular solutions. And then we've got a full programme through March, April, May, and all the way till mid-June. So we'll keep you updated on all of that. Have a really great weekend. Thank you very much for logging in and watching and for all of the questions. Thank you. Goodbye from our family to yours.